News. My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier. Some fast-paced news from 4 until 6 in the next hour. Anyone caught piloting a boat carrying migrants in the English Channel could now face life behind bars after the introduction of parts of the Nationality and Borders Act. The number of migrants crossing the Channel so far this year has reached over 12,000 compared to just over 5,000 this time last year. Could the Act be part of an effective deterrent to stop illegal traffickers bringing people across to the UK on small boats? The director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity, Stephen Wolfe, will have his say. What is it like living in a community, if that's the right word, of tourists? There's been a 40% rise in the number of holiday lets in England, with estate agents reporting a surge in second home ownership during the course of the pandemic. Residents say locals are now being pushed out of areas they grew up in. I'll speak to someone who says it's ruining their local area, and the property expert Russell Quirk. As the Met Police is placed under special measures for poor performance, we'll ask what makes a successful police force. At 4:30, we'll be joined by a former Met Police officer and the Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire. They'll hear your thoughts and take your questions. Send me your thoughts on what you'd like to see from your local police force. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk. And with me for the course of the next 2 hours, the editor of The Oldie, Harry Mount. But first, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. Good afternoon. The top stories this hour. NATO leaders meeting in Madrid have decided to officially invite Finland and Sweden to become members of their military alliance. It was made possible after Turkey withdrew objections. Meanwhile, the United States has announced plans to boost its military presence across Europe in response to changing threats. NATO's Secretary-General says the decision to invite Finland and Sweden demonstrates its door remains open. He said the alliance is being transformed at a pivotal time.
Today, at the summit, NATO leaders decided a fundamental shift in our defence and deterrence to respond to a new security reality. We will strengthen our forward defences. We will enhance our battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance up to brigade levels. We will transform the NATO response force and increase the number of high readiness forces to well over 300,000.
Meanwhile, the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the UK government has been getting its defence policy wrong for years.
The Tory government has been cutting defence for 10 years now. And despite what they said in 2019 at election time, they're planning to cut 10,000 more from our armed forces. Now, we, the Labour Party, have always put the defence of our nation first and called on them to halt that further cut. What I want to see now is a reboot in light of what's happened in the Ukraine. I want to see the government come forward with a review, and that has to include spending, because they've obviously got it wrong over a number of years now, and I think they're beginning to recognise that.
The Court of Appeal has ruled the decision to end life support treatment for a 12-year-old boy should be reconsidered. The High Court had concluded Archie Battersby was likely dead and said doctors could lawfully stop providing treatment. His parents appealed that decision, and today 3 judges said there should be another High Court hearing. A date for reviewing the case hasn't yet been set. The policing minister has accused the Mayor of London of being asleep at the wheel over failures by the Metropolitan Police. Kit Malthouse was speaking after the force was placed under special measures by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary following a series of scandals, including the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer. Mr Malthouse said Sergeant Javid needs to stop blaming others.
The Mayor has been asleep at the wheel and is letting the city down. Teenage homicides in London were the highest they've ever been in the last year, and 23% of all knife crime takes place in London, despite it having only 15% of the UK population. The Mayor must acknowledge that he has profound questions to answer. He cannot be passive and continue as he has. He must get a grip.
Well, in Prime Minister's questions, Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner challenged the government for losing 2 by-elections in one day last week, as she and Dominic Raab deputised in the Commons.
It's no wonder that the Prime Minister has fled the country and left the honourable member to carry the can. The people of Wakefield and Tiverton held their own vote of no confidence. The Prime Minister isn't just losing the room, Mr Speaker, he's losing the country. But instead of showing some humility, he intends to limp on until the 2030s. So does he think the Cabinet will prop him up for this long?
Prime Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady. I gently point out to her that we want this Prime Minister to go on a lot longer than she wants the leader of the Labour Party to go on.
A package of quotas and tariffs on steel imports is being extended by 2 years, despite breaching Britain's legal obligations under the World Trade Organization. The International Trade Secretary, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, says it's justified to safeguard Britain's economy against the energy market and supply chain disruptions.
We obviously stand ready to take up any concerns that WTO members may have on our decision, but I am absolutely certain that it is the right decision in order to ensure that we avoid as much harm or risk of injury to our steel producers as we can.
And the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have paid tribute to Dame Deborah James, describing her as an inspirational and unfalteringly brave woman whose legacy will live on. The podcaster, known as Bowel Babe, died yesterday at the age of 40, 5.5 years after being diagnosed with incurable bowel cancer. Donations to the fund she set up for cancer research have now hit £6.8 million. Speaking on her podcast, Dame Deborah convinced listener Margaret Murta to check her symptoms. Margaret was then diagnosed, treated and survived bowel cancer.
I was messaging her, and she was messaging back. She had lots of followers, but she was just so kind and so sweet, and was giving me advice when I was in hospital, saying, what was your, what was the size of your tumour? And actually, when we met up, she was so lovely. She was like, come in the picture, let's take a selfie. And she was so sweet. We were comparing sort of tumour sizes. She was like, oh, mine was 6.5 centimetres. And I was like, oh, God, mine was 7. And the one thing she said was that I am so pleased that you are the reason why I do this work, because you are an early stage survivor.
You're up to date on TV and online and on radio. You're with GB News. More news as it happens. Now back to Brazier.
Eight minutes past 4. Now, the government's plan to deter Channel migrants is on hold, thanks in part to legal challenges from human rights lawyers. But yesterday, and with almost no fanfare or attention, the government introduced a new way, it hopes, of deterring the ever-growing number of asylum seekers who use dinghies to reach Britain. Elements of the new Nationality and Borders Act have now come into force. The Act creates a new legal power which has the potential, you could argue, to be a game-changer if it's implemented robustly. What's the change? Well, right now, British courts have the right to jail people smugglers for life, but in reality, traffickers are not the ones actually on the boats. They're too smart for that. So what does this new law do? It targets the individual who is effectively skippering one of these dinghies, whose hand is on the tiller, literally, and whose decision to pilot the vessel is putting the lives of migrants at risk. If asylum seekers knew that the person who took charge of their boat on the beach could face life in a British prison, is it possible that the number of migrants willing to take charge of the outboard motor, they all need one to get across the channel, might dry up, and with them, the number of illegal crossings? It's complicated, but there's something in this. Let's turn to the Director for the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity, Stephen Wolfe, who joins me now. And Stephen, you've pondered on many occasions, including with me, on how it is possible to mount an effective deterrence. Is there something in this, do you think?
Colin, I've looked at many things in the new bill, and also that new bill on human rights and the Bill of Rights by Dominic Raab. And I've been supportive of the government in many respects, but on this particular kind of policy and the law, I don't think it's going to have an enormous amount of effect at all. And let me give you a reason why. By 3:30 a.m. this morning, the French frigates were already collecting the ribs full of migrants, channel migrants, and they were putting on board their boats. And then they transferred them to our ships. So this morning, there were 3 Royal Navy ships out there, along with 4 Border Force ships. So none of those that were being picked up by our Border Force or Vigilante that represents our Navy, they were not coming in on ribs, so the government wasn't going to be able to identify one single person who was controlling the rib that left France, and that's why I think it will fail.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating and depressing. I mean, it's a misnomer, the idea that I was introducing there at the top of the programme, that somebody on the beach, somebody's deputed to be, in quotes, a pilot or a skipper in a de facto way. They're the ones with the hand on the outboard motor. And if we, the British government or Border Force, could intercept that dinghy, could take a picture, for instance, of the person with a hand on the tiller, they could then offer up some exemplary sentences, for instance, years on a stretch, because, after all, this is somebody who's agreed effectively to take charge of this dangerous crossing. But what you're saying, Stephen, is actually increasingly that those dinghies aren't even involved, at least not in our waters where it would matter.
Exactly, and that's why I think that you're quite right, that if a Royal Navy, Border Force, or indeed anybody who had the capability of taking those photographs could do so, they would have to be in our waters. They couldn't be in the French waters. And so it doesn't seem as though it's going to be one of those that they'll be able to rely on practically. Maybe in those circumstances where the ribs containing these channel migrants evade the French boats, which is unlikely because they want them to help them, and get into our shores, that somebody on the UK side of things takes a photograph, then we'd be able to do so. But if you look at many of them, they're already covered in their faces by the time they get over here in any event. So it is something that the government can use. I welcome it, obviously, to have anything that can help. But generally, I think this one's going to be one of the weakest parts of the new pieces of legislation. Just take a look this morning, Colin. So far, we've had about 500 channel migrants arrive today. That's 1.75 million that the people traffickers have made. It will cost us around 20 million, and it's probably the equivalent of 5 hotels. It's not stopping. We really need to get those planes, deporting them to Rwanda, to have any major impact.
Stephen, as ever, thanks for picking us through the detail of it. It's that's where the big decisions lie, isn't it? Thanks very much indeed, Stephen Wolfe. Harry Mount alongside me here to ponder on this one, an imponderable question, isn't it? We've been thinking about it for months and years. Rwanda, says Stephen Wolfe, not necessarily the new Borders and Nationality Act. It might help a little bit, he says.
It seems very unlikely. You can imagine any trafficker thinking, the British Parliament has passed this law. I'm not going to go out tomorrow morning in one of those ribs. It seems to me that Rwanda isn't working either.
Not yet.
It's too early to say. But you've got 2 options, really. Either you let it happen, or the only way to stop it is to do something ruthless. The famous example that's always used is Australia. When they started being ruthless and deporting those asylum seekers, the number trying to do it collapsed. So it's hard to justify it, because it is, by its very nature, ruthless. But you're either ruthless and it works, or you're toothless and it doesn't work.
Yeah. OK, Harry, thanks very much indeed. A boom in staycations over the COVID pandemic has led to a 40% rise in the number of people buying properties to rent out to tourists in England. The seaside town of Scarborough has seen the biggest rise in holiday-let properties, with almost 1,000 more rental homes now than there were in 2018. In second place, North Devon, where the figure went from 1,319 to in excess of 1,700. East Suffolk, third, a rise of 139 properties. The Isle of Wight also saw numbers grow there to over 1,000. Some campaigners are calling for tighter regulations, as they claim holiday-let properties are pushing established residents from communities and ruining any sense of neighbourliness within a local area. Let's turn to the property expert, Russell Quirk, who joins me now. Russell, welcome to you. We're spending a lot of time at the moment discussing second properties, holiday lets, and what impact they have on social cohesion. We know there have been votes in some communities, Whitby most recently. Sometimes people are accused of being NIMBYs. Other people say if it wasn't for these second homeowners, where would the money come from? Where do you stand on this?
Well, I'm in favour of a free market, Colin. So I think that the residents of York and Great Yarmouth and Scarborough and Brighton and Whitby should actually be maybe grateful that lots and lots of people from elsewhere in the country actually want to buy in their towns. And of course, what that does for maybe not just the property sector, but restaurant owners, bar owners, shops and cafe owners is to shore up the local economy. Actually, the kind of the NIMBYist reaction is that the influx of second home buyers who, of course, have decided over the pandemic to invest in property because house prices have escalated so much over the last couple of years. And of course, they also then get a yield from renting those properties out to staycationers. So obviously a very appealing investment. The rhetoric we often hear from those NIMBYs is that this practice of buying second homes in those towns has actually disproportionately affected house prices. Well, the data simply doesn't support that. And actually, if you look at the numbers, where we've seen a kind of runaway housing market over the last couple of years, as an example, the UK has seen increases of house prices of around 12% per annum. So in the last 12 months, house prices across the UK generally are up 12%. Whereas in York, one of the examples that's used in the story today, house prices are up to 7%, and they're up by even less than that in Great Yarmouth. So actually, there's no data to support the fact that house prices are running away disproportionately in seaside towns. And therefore, I think, Colin, the last thing we want is regulation and intervention, because in my experience, that generally doesn't end well when governments and local authorities intervene in those free markets.
Yeah, interesting on the price rises, actually. I wouldn't have expected that. There are different problems at work here, aren't there? And the NIMBY charge is a loaded one, isn't it? I mean, it's a slur almost, and at times it feels wrong to hurl it at people. I mean, for instance, if you've been in a semi-detached house for decades and the person next door buys it as a holiday let, they're not there very often, they do the Airbnb thing, and suddenly you've got this conveyor belt of total strangers moving in. Some of them behave well, this being human nature we're talking about, some of them behave badly. But what you've lost is that sense of neighbourliness and social cohesion, and you've got this itinerant neighbour about whom you know nothing.
Well, yes, maybe. And I guess at the extreme fringes, maybe there are people that hire holiday homes and kind of misbehave. But I think that's a minority. I don't see there being any charges of the majority of second or rather holiday home vacationers renting properties and kind of having wild parties till 5 o'clock in the morning. So I think we need to keep a sense of perspective, and we certainly need to keep a sense of perspective when it comes to the number of second homes and holiday homes in each area. We're talking about some very hefty percentage increases here in Scarborough, Great Yarmouth and elsewhere, York, for instance. But actually, in real terms, year on year, we're talking about maybe an increase of 100 holiday homes here and 130 there. And this is in a kind of a town where perhaps there's 100,000 homes. So we do need to keep a sense of perspective here. And I think, unfortunately, this whole issue does become politicised. And you get a lot of local councils that maybe get a few moans and whinges from people with not much else to do as residents. They lobby their councillors. The councillors then move a motion at council because it grabs a headline and makes it look as though they're doing the right thing. And I think it's politicised and it's kind of quite opportunistic. I don't think it's as big a problem as perhaps we think it might be.
Russell Quirk, appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mount's thoughts. Harry.
Well, I must declare an interest. My family share a second home in beautiful Pembrokeshire, which is one of those hotspots where second homes have been soaring in recent years. But I agree with Russell. I think it's a free country. It's terrible to restrict people on where they can buy homes, whether they're first or second homes. I think the answer is what they're beginning to do in some of those towns near our holiday home in Pembrokeshire. Pembroke, a beautiful ancient medieval town. There, a not very pretty supermarket closed down because of the decline of the high street there, like in so many places. And that's being turned into residential flats, both for locals and for second homeowners. So that seems to be a clever way of doing it. You improve that problem of the declining high street and you just produce more houses. I also think let more houses be built more sensitively and more beautifully. That seems to be the answer, as opposed to turning on people who, as Russell said, and you said in your introduction, do improve the local economy.
Harry, thanks very much indeed. It's been confirmed Finland and Sweden will receive formal invitations to join the NATO alliance. Russia has described the move, announced at the NATO summit in Madrid, as destabilising. Let's turn to the chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, who joins us now. Tobias Ellwood, thanks for your time. Before we get into defence spending, threat posed by Russia, as a punctuation mark in the evolving story of NATO, how important is this summit in Madrid?
I think in one sense it's a sad juncture because these are two countries, Sweden and Finland, that have spent many years, decades, treading a very careful line with Russia, not to upset the apple cart, recognizing the sensitivity of the alliance just on the doorstep of Russia, but now feeling that the security situation has deteriorated so significantly, not just around Ukraine, but that we've entered a new era of insecurity, that they feel that they must now join this club. They need the protection of Article 5. They need to be part of this alliance. And I think this has gone against what Russia was expecting when they joined Ukraine. But it is symbolic of the turning point in our history, and that's worrying for everybody.
Can I just ask a rather silly layman's question? We just flashed up a picture of Erdogan, the Turkish leader. What do you say to those who argue, and I'm even inclined to argue it myself, that within NATO, Turkey exerts too much influence? They can't work out, it seems to me, it will seem to others, at times whose side they're on. They seem to be quite friendly towards Moscow at a time like this.
Yes, I mean, Turkey is an interesting position, and you're right to highlight what they've done in playing a bit of a game here by claiming that there are Kurds in Sweden, particularly, that are somehow linked to the PKK, the terrorist organization that Turkey is up against, and therefore used it as leverage to gain concessions to do with F-16s, which they've now achieved. The agreement has taken place, and that's because NATO works by consensus. Ultimately, it's better to keep working with Turkey. They need to recognize, as do other countries, I have to say, Brazil, South Africa, India as well, that the threat is against Putin and the Kremlin, not against the Russian people per se. And we need to up our game. We are too risk averse. NATO itself is shoring up its own defenses within inside that club, but it's not willing to put the fire out right outside the club, as we see in Ukraine. And the consequences of that is that fire is likely to spread to other parts of Eastern Europe.
4 or 5 months ago, when this conflict in Ukraine was beginning, that the conversation on the airwaves ran to the idea of seriously expanding defence expenditure. People were talking about 3.5%, 4% of GDP. That's gone away.
I don't think it's gone away. There's now absolute focus on what we should do with our defence spending. You can't have ministers and people like myself, even the head of the army, the CGS, suggesting that there's now a 1937 feel to the world at the moment and then not react to that. The world is more dangerous and going to get more dangerous, not less. We need to up our defence spend. We're on a peacetime budget at the moment. Last year, we saw swathing cuts to our armed forces personnel, 10,000 in the army, to tanks, to armoured fighting vehicles, Hercules aircraft scrapped, F-35 fleet reduced as well. These all now need to be reversed. We've entered, as I say, a new geopolitical framework, and we need more money to be able to pay for that. And ultimately, because inflation is where it is, that's going to see a real-time reduction in our defence spending. NATO itself, on its own figures that I've put out on my tweet, show that by 2025, we're down to 2%. And that's not including the inflationary figures heading towards double figures now. So if we want to lead by example, we've done well in supporting Ukraine. We do need to increase defence spending immediately.
Tobias Elwood MP, appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Coming up here, the government's latest plan to tax electric cars as they face a big hole in the public finances as drivers switch to electric. We'll speak to the motoring journalist Quentin Wilson next. Back in a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you. We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Lots of you in touch with your thoughts on migrant crossings in the English Channel, the possibility, well, not so much of the traffickers, but the person who's actually controlling the outboard motor, the people piloting the boats, being at risk of life in prison. This is according to parts of the new Borders and Nationality Act, which would have that penalty for the people piloting these craft. Marianne says, why is our Navy accepting a handover of immigrants? This is what's been happening in the middle of the English Channel between the French and British vessels. Marianne says we would have to use planes to take aerial photographs to find who is steering the boat. More than that, the French should not be transporting these migrants into our waters. Stephen says, why don't Border Force just take the illegal immigrants straight to a camp to wait a flight to Rwanda? This will stop them having contact with any lawyers and therefore stop any legal challenges. Got a feeling it's not necessarily that simple, sadly. Nichols says, why bother punishing the driver of the boat when illegal boat people are rescued by a French Coast Guard and rescue vessels? Are we then allowing the French to transfer them to British Coast Guard and rescue vessels? The second they step on the French ship, they become a French problem, not ours. He makes his point with an exclamation mark. We should refuse to take them, he says. Keep them coming in. The government's facing a potentially really big hole in public finances as they urge drivers to switch to electric. They're not taking a lot of urging at the moment, drivers, with fuel being the price it is. Last year, fuel duty brought in £28 million to the government's coffers. Electric car drivers, as you probably know, they pay no fuel duty, obviously, and VAT on domestic electricity is only charged at around 5% because the government's not yet cottoned on it can be the cash cow that the fuel you put in your car is. It's 20% on fuel, at least. The latest plan to plug that gap is a pay-by-the-mile tax on electric vehicles. The proposals by the government's own climate advisors would see electric cars fitted with tracking devices, charging drivers according to how many miles they drive. The motoring journalist and transport campaigner Quentin Wilson joins us now. Quentin, welcome to you. There'll be people uncomfortable about the phrase tracking devices, but this is a really big hole in the public coffers, isn't it? What do we do?
Yeah, it's 28 billion, Colin, not 28 million. And it's a massive slug of money for the Treasury, which they can't do without, but they're going to have to work around it. So I think a form of pay as you drive is obvious, and it's coming. And I think what you'd need to do is you'd need to take away vehicle excise duty, that's road tax, as they used to call it, and take away fuel duty. And then you would have some people who would be paying less to use the roads than they do now. And if you do a system whereby you pay less if you use roads when they're not busy, then we have an opportunity of reducing congestion. But yes, sure, electric cars need to pay their way just like other cars. But I would imagine, and this is just me thinking out loud, that we would have a system where those who pollute the most pay the most. So hopefully electric cars wouldn't pay the same as an ancient diesel pickup truck that's badly maintained and chucking out PM10s. So this all needs to be worked out. And it's a political hot potato and no government really wants to go near it right now. But, 2030 is not far away, and the government needs to start thinking and talking about this and saying, right, this is what we want to do, and canvassing public opinion.
And setting aside the potential ideological objections, is the technological wherewithal there to do it? These stories have been kicked around, pay by the mile, not necessarily in connection with electric cars, but cars more generally for years. The motorway gantries, cameras, but actually with GPS, you don't need that sort of stuff, do you? You would just use the GPS.
We've got all this stuff in our cars already, Colin. You're absolutely right. And these outraged people who say, well, look, this is Big Brother watching me. I'm not going to have a tracking device. Listen, mate, you got it in your phone. You've got it in your car. You've got it in your smartwatch. So that technology is there. And when I drive to France, I have a little thing on my windscreen, a tag that lets me drive through the tolls without stopping. So all this stuff is here and now. We just need to use it cleverly and intelligently. And the key word here, Colin, is fairly. This has to be a fair system where people who can't afford to pay to use the roads have some sort of subsidy. We've got to make it so the roads are better. So we are investing more in roads, so we use them at the right times and not all flock at rush hour, and that those who pollute the most have to pay the most.
Quentin Wilson, as ever, fascinating chat. Thanks a lot. Harry Mount alongside me. I'm minded not to put this question to you because I know you're a keen cyclist. You don't necessarily have a dog in this fight, or do you?
Well, I did used to own a car, and I'm very pro car owners. I think I've had a very rough time. I sold my car because I spent my whole time in London stuck in traffic for the reasons Quentin was saying. And I think car owners have had a really rough time the last 20 years or so. They're encouraged to move in certain directions. Remember the time when they were encouraged to buy diesels, and then they were told that was bad.
For which we never got the sufficient apology from government, which we deserved, I think.
Exactly. And then they've been encouraged to buy electric cars, and if this comes in, which I don't approve of, then they're being battered for something that they thought they were doing the right thing. So I think if you want to encourage people to take the greener option, then you give them the benefit of lower tax as a result.
Yeah. Harry, for now, thanks very much indeed. You're with Colin Brazier on GB News. Coming up, I'm going to give you my take on the good, the bad and the ugly of online fundraising. Stay with me for that. And the Met Police, London's police force, placed under special measures for doing badly. We'll ask what makes a successful police force. Going to be joined by a former Met Police officer and the Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire, who's always got a strong opinion or two. And we'll get some of your thoughts and try and take some of your questions too. In the meantime, latest news headlines with Polly.
Good afternoon. The latest news headlines. As we were saying, NATO leaders meeting in Madrid have decided to officially invite Finland and Sweden to become members of the alliance. NATO's Secretary-General says the decision demonstrates the alliance's door remains open, and he said NATO is being transformed at a pivotal time.
Today, at the summit, NATO leaders decided a fundamental shift in our defence and deterrence to respond to a new security reality. We will strengthen our forward defences. We will enhance our battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance up to brigade levels. We will transform the NATO response force and increase the number of high readiness forces to well over 300,000.
Here, the Court of Appeal has ruled the decision to end life support treatment for a 12-year-old boy should be reconsidered. Our apologies, the wrong pictures there if you're watching on television. Let me bring you up to date with this story. A royal source says the Prince of Wales would never again handle large cash donations for his charities. For the first time, a senior palace source has responded to reports that emerged at the weekend that Prince Charles was handed €3 million cash in a bag by a Qatari sheikh. Speaking to the Sunday Times newspaper, Clarence House said the money was passed immediately to his charities and all the right processes were followed. And more on that story I was trying to bring you just now. The Court of Appeal has ruled the decision to end life support treatment for a 12-year-old boy should be reconsidered. The High Court had concluded Archie Battersby was likely to be dead and said doctors could lawfully stop providing treatment. His parents, though, appealed that decision, and today 3 judges said there should be another High Court hearing. A date for reviewing the case, though, hasn't yet been set. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News, and it's back to Brazier in just a bit.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you. We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know. The latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Three very different stories of sickness from this week's news of illnesses, shared with millions in a way that until fairly recently would have been simply impossible. They concern three very different people in possession of three very different moral compasses. Let's call them the good, the bad and the ugly. The ugly? Step forward holidaymaker Wolf Jenkins. He posted a video of himself on TikTok, now viewed over 1 million times, in which the 28-year-old student boasted of how he faked having a foot injury to beat the queues at Bodrum Airport in Turkey. He abused a system reserved for genuinely unwell or disabled passengers to secure himself a wheelchair and a row of empty seats on the plane back to Bristol. What about the bad? Well, another fake illness. This one wasn't the subject of online boasting, but without the internet, it couldn't have happened in the way it did. It's the case of a 44-year-old former Harrods fashion consultant. Nicole Elka-Abbas set up a GoFundMe page, told strangers she needed to raise money urgently for private ovarian cancer treatment. People were moved by her plight and pictures of her in a hospital bed, but in reality, it was all an ugly con. Elka-Abbas didn't have cancer. That picture on the wards, it was from a previous hospital visit for routine surgery on her gallbladder. What gall, indeed. Her GoFundMe page raised £45,000 from well-wishers, which she blew on holidays and high living. This week, a judge at Canterbury Crown Court jailed her for 2 years for fraud and deception. Finally, the good. Again, a story that would have been impossible in the pre-internet age, the remarkable example set by cancer campaigner, blogger and former teacher Dame Deborah James, who's died at the age of 40. She used the audience the internet allowed her to reach with her podcasts and Instagram posts to raise awareness of a type of cancer that is sometimes pushed into the shadows. She raised millions of pounds for the relevant charities, hers a tale to reaffirm our sometimes faltering faith in human nature. Online charities will always be vulnerable to the schemes of venal manipulators like the fake cancer patient Nicole Elka-Abbas. Systems designed to help the vulnerable can be abused by selfish queue jumpers like our student friend from Bristol who boasted of his ruse on TikTok. But the internet has also done far more good than harm when it comes to raising money for good causes and starting conversations about diseases that need to be discussed openly. The example set by Dame Deborah James is a reminder that for those who want to, sickness can be chronicled online in a way that can demystify a journey that all of us will one day face. It's the Brazier angle. Just turn to Harry Mount, who's my studio guest today. Online fraud, when it comes to charitable giving, there's not much of it, but you can see how the sort of fraud I talked about there can happen. People see an appeal on Facebook or whatever. OK, I'll give her some money, I'll give him some money. It can happen.
Yes, and I imagine there are very few bad apples like the one you pointed out, and it's the strange thing about the internet. It can be absolutely wonderful, do extraordinary things with it, but the price you pay is that very few people will abuse it. And I'd thought rather than trying to get rid of those bad apples to begin with, you have to accept them as the price to pay for this remarkable way of raising money, as has just happened.
And a remarkable way of telling stories, very often as well, Harry. Thanks very much indeed. Well, yesterday, the Metropolitan Police was placed under special measures by the policing watchdog after what has been described as a series of failures. Away from the Metropolitan Police and the streets of London, what do you want from your police force? Is it even possible to have a truly successful service? What does it look like? Let's start by speaking to retired Met Police officer Chris Hobbs, and we'll also turn to the Hampshire Police and Crime Commissioner Donna Jones, who's going to be joining us as well. Chris, we'll start with you if I can. On this show, we've talked before about the failure, for instance, of forces to keep open police stations. I think they're closing at the rate in England of around one a fortnight. We've talked about the failure of police officers to investigate burglaries. Are these the types of things that the Met is getting wrong?
Basically, I wouldn't say getting wrong. I think at the moment the problem the Met has got, apart from issues around leadership, recruitment, vetting, and the public perception of the Met, is the fact that they are overwhelmed, quite simply overwhelmed with what they're supposed to be doing. Every month you get someone saying you need to do more about this, you need to do more about that. And when it happens, officers are taken away from one lot of duties and put on another lot of duties to deal with that particular problem. Moped crime, you might remember, was one example. And they really are under pressure. The poor officers on response, PBR, poor bloody response, they're the ones who you see blue lights, two tones, rushing to emergencies. Not enough of them, nowhere near enough of them. On my borough, when I was a young PC, we would field 17 to 20 vehicles to cover Ealing, the borough where I live. Now you're lucky if they get 7 vehicles out there. Sometimes less. Some boroughs are covered by 1 vehicle for a whole shift. They're really struggling, and part of that, you have to say, is it's got to be down to senior management for letting that happen. I was on Twitter yesterday, and lots of officers were coming back when I mentioned this problem, saying, this is what we had to put up with, this is what we had to put up with. That's at the front line, that's the police that people see. That's the reason why you don't necessarily get your calls answered, or you go home and find your house has been burgled. But unlike in our time, where we would go round, perhaps no one will turn up at all. If you've got suspects on, if someone's in your house and burgling it, then everyone will move to get there, if there are units available. And mental health, my goodness, 40,000 calls the Met responded to last year, to with people with mental health. A serious problem for police who have to deal with it, and most of the time deal with it extremely well. My friend's a mental health nurse. She's a point of contact for police in North West London. She has nothing but praise for the patience, kindness, compassion of officers who have to deal with these difficult cases, sometimes for hours and hours at a time. Does that get the publicity? No. When something goes wrong, yes, it should. But at the moment, the whole force is being collectively smeared, and that's really harsh on those who are doing a fantastic job.
Donna Jones, you speak to the challenges of Hampshire, but I wonder if we can just focus on the Met to begin with. It is by far and away the biggest police force in the United Kingdom. It faces particular challenges, doesn't it? Obviously, it's in charge of things like coordinating our response to terrorist attacks and that sort of thing. But it's also, it would seem to some people, and certainly over the years I've talked to former officers about this, it's had particular problems with retention. And you could argue there's that missing layer of experienced officers who have that trickle down of knowledge and experience to the new recruits. And the new recruits are being taken on after the cuts of 10 years ago. But there is that gap, that experiential gap.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And as well as being the commissioner here in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, I am also the national lead for victims amongst police and crime commissioners. So do kind of speak across the UK with that voice. And I think there are 3 things the public want from policing. Number 1, they want them to solve crimes, detect crimes, and get dangerous people off our streets or in some kind of community punishment if they're not going to prison. Number 2, they want them to prevent crimes. And number 3, when the police do have, powers given to them by statute of law in this country, they want them to use those powers appropriately, and they want them to use them in a proportionate way. And I think, I actually agree with a number of the points that Chris has just made. There are thousands upon thousands of excellent, upstanding men and women working in the Metropolitan Police Service, whether they be officers or they be police staff or volunteers. And unfortunately, there have been a number of failings in the Met over the last couple of years that have led to them being or going to be put into special measures when that inspectorate report is published in the next couple of weeks. Do I think that's the right thing to do? Well, actually, with calm reflection, yes, because when a force is put into special measures, it means one thing: things can only get better. I do think that there have been a number of issues in the Metropolitan Police Service, and coming back to the point that you've just made, that it is the largest police force in the UK. There are 43 police forces in England and Wales, and the Metropolitan Police is by far the largest. And actually, if you look at the issues in the Met Police, they're not dissimilar to dysfunctional policing behaviours in capital cities around the world because of the complexities of the demographics, the levels of serious organised crime, the harm harm that's coming into those very built-up conurbations. Now, that's not an excuse, that's an explanation for people who are watching your programme and scratching their heads as to why this has all come about. So I do think that the Home Office, the Home Secretary, the Policing Minister, Kit Malthouse, surely must now be given consideration to whether or not the Metropolitan Police is just too big, and whether or not it's, to empower perhaps district commanders more, to give them back the flex, as Chris has said, to when he was, policing the streets of Ealing with a much bigger command structure, and I'm sure a much more empowered district commander in that area. So is the Met too big? Should we be looking to break it up into, multiple smaller police forces, or should we be looking to alter their command structure to give district commanders actually the flex that they need to be able to make London streets safer?
And as you say, Donna, have a sense of perspective. Remember, as a capital city, it faces particular challenges as well. Donna, Chris, you're both insiders in a sense. You've both got a professional interest in this story. Let's turn to Coral Fordham. Coral was burgled in 2017 after she arrived back from holiday. Never a good time to be burgled. That's even less helpful, isn't it? Coral, welcome to you. Tell us about your experience.
Completely awful, to be honest with you. And I think the thing, and I'm sure both Chris and Donna will appreciate, is how the victims are left afterwards. We arrived back home, the back door had been kicked in, all of our family heirlooms had been taken, the place was turned upside down. My husband wouldn't even let me go in the house. We had to go and get a neighbour who phoned 999. Nobody could come and see us until the next day, and they said, do not touch anything. So it's difficult, but try and put yourself in that position where you've just got home, someone has been in your house, you don't know what's actually been taken at that point because drawers are out everywhere, it's a complete nightmare. You can't actually believe what's happening to you, and you're meant to stay there the night and wait for the police to come the next day. Completely unacceptable. When
Chris
they did arrive,
Sorry, Coral, go on. Yeah, carry on.
So when they did arrive the following day, obviously we'd had to spend the night there with the hole in the door. And we had to touch certain things, but forensics came round and, did whatever they were supposed to be doing. But we didn't really hear anything. And it's just left my husband and I, we're different people. Every time you go out of the house. And the annoying thing is, one of the many annoying things, is I don't think those people ever got caught. And as the policeman said to us, if they did, what would they get? You tell me what someone would get. And then we found out that apparently there was a group working the area, so we'd probably been targeted. So there were other burglaries going on. But we lived in quite a rural area, fair enough. But there was no presence of police at all, at any time. The police station was shut. Sorry, Colin,
Okay.
you're trying to speak.
No, I am.
It's
I am
close to
only.
my heart.
I'm going to put some of the points that you've raised to Chris Hobbs, who's a former detective from the Metropolitan Police, and obviously, Chris, Coral's experience in rural Cambridgeshire is very different from your policing experience in West London, but it does touch on elements of what we've been discussing. She was a victim of burglary. We know, don't we, that there's a feeling abroad, there's a feeling amongst the public that the police do not right now take burglary seriously enough. And she mentioned the closure of police stations. We had an extraordinary account given recently of somebody who came on this show and talked about being involved in a road rage incident. She was terrified. She drove to the nearest police station only to find it was shut.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in closing police stations was a huge error. And they're still closing them, amazingly enough. Big mistake. They give a sense of security. The police are there in that station. They're going to and from work. Even if it's not open to the public, they're going out doing their shopping there. It's a presence. It's a secure presence. As far as the response to burglary is concerned, when I was the young PC, a burglary victim could expect perhaps as many as 4 visits from the reporting officers, as we were, on relief or on response, as they're called. A CID officer will go around perhaps the next morning. He will determine whether a scenes of crime officer needs or could attend to get some value in terms of forensic, and then a crime prevention officer to come around and advise the householder of how to improve security. That, by and large, has almost gone. Burglary used to be a priority crime when I was on the crime squad. It now isn't, because other things have overtaken it.
Well, just Chris, on the point about other things, Donna Jones, I don't mean to sound flippant, maybe I'm about to sound flippant, but I'm looking at my Twitter feed and I can see somebody who I follow who posted this morning a picture of two Metropolitan Police officers policing, I think, a Pride march, and they're pictured with two people, I can put it no more kindly, than wearing gimp suits. There is a sense at large that the police have different priorities. Sometimes they're politically charged and they've lost sight of the essential tasks of policing, including things like burglaries.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's some good feedback. I've had some very specific casework around that. We don't want to see police officers wearing rainbow hats. We want to see them. We want to see them out, detecting crime and responding when we call 999 and 101. And that's not my view. I'm repeating a piece of casework I've had recently. I think I'm very, very sorry, first of all, to hear about your burglary. I mean, I think it's one of the horriblest things. It's your privacy, it's your sanctuary, it's your security, it's your home. And your police commissioner, Darryl Preston, I will be speaking to him and letting him know about this. And in fact, I will send him this link so he can watch and take that feedback for you, because I am very sorry to hear that. Unfortunately, burglary rates in the UK, the detection have dropped. If you are being burgled right now, there is someone in my house right now. When you phone 999, it's categorised as a Category 1 call, i.e. it's urgent and the person is being burgled right now. If you come home and you have been burgled, past tense, and you come home and the intruder is not there, then it is categorised as either a Category 2 or 3 999 response. And unfortunately, because of the drop in police numbers, that's why we have seen this categorisation of offences, meaning there is a huge disparity between the urgent 999 calls that come in and those that then get categorised to later that day or the next day. Now, the National Police Uplift programme should really start to take some giant steps forward to get us back to where we were. We know 20,000 extra police officers will be recruited by the end of March next year. I think we need to go further than that. We probably need nearer 35,000 because of the growth in population and also because of the complexity and social breakdown. ASB absolutely spiralling last year, particularly because of the lockdown and young people not having anything to do and being bored. Policing is becoming more complex, but ultimately it is a numbers game, and the more police we have, the more crime we'll prevent and the more crime that we will detect.
And I'm about to say something really obvious, but it all takes money, Donna, doesn't it? And we've just had a Defence Select Committee chairman saying we need more money for the Army. We've got barristers early in the week saying we need more money, teachers saying the same. We had the rail strikes last week. Usually the squeaky wheel, as they say in America, gets the oil. I wonder if the Police Federation are making enough noise to attract the resources that policing clearly needs. Donna, Chris, Coral, thanks all very much indeed for your time. And we'll just end with some emails, because you've been emailing, and unsurprisingly on this. Edward says, I'd like them to go back to keeping the peace in public places and investigating property crime and serious violence. To achieve this, we must get rid of all criminal hate speech and equality legislation and other similarly dystopian laws. Deborah says, stand up to the mob instead of running away. Police, according to the law, regardless of race, religion or colour, depoliticise, get rid of woke, employ ex-servicemen and women who are prepared to stand up to the feral youth of today, reopen police stations, restore trust. Ollie says, I want them to concentrate on solving crimes and not virtue signalling to groups who are overtly political. Harry Mount's got 15 seconds to make his point about policing in Britain. Can you do it?
Well, on the Met Police, I've lived in London all my life. I did used to report when my bikes were stolen. I don't anymore. I sympathise with the police, but actually you realise nothing will be done.
Harry, for now, thanks very much indeed. Much more news coming up. Stay with us.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you. We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier. Coming up live at 5, former Border Force Chief Kevin Saunders will have his say on whether the threat of life behind bars will be enough to deter traffickers bringing migrants across the Channel to the UK. The number of those crossing the Channel so far this year has reached in excess of 12,000. That compares to 5,000 this time last year. What to do? What is it like living in a community, in quotes, of tourists? There's been a 40% rise in the number of holiday lets in England, with estate agents reporting a surge in second home ownership during the pandemic. I'll speak to someone who says it's pushing locals out of her area and ruining neighbourhoods. Also this hour, there are now more older people living in the UK than ever before, as 1 in 6 of us are over the age of 65. We'll ask, is an ageing population a good thing? And as the cost of Lurpak spread, it's over £7.25. Yikes. We want to know your biggest recent price shocks. Do send us your photos of your everyday price rises and we'll all recoil in horror together. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk. With me for the next hour, the editor of the Oldie, no stranger to recoiling himself, Harry Mount. But first, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. The top stories on GB News. NATO leaders meeting in Madrid have decided to officially invite Finland and Sweden to become members of the military alliance. It was made possible after Turkey withdrew objections. Meanwhile, the United States has announced plans to boost its military presence across Europe in response to what it calls changing threats. NATO's Secretary-General says the decision to invite Finland and Sweden demonstrates its door remains open. He also said the alliance was being transformed at a pivotal time.
Today, at the summit, NATO leaders decided a fundamental shift in our defence and deterrence to respond to a new security reality. We will strengthen our forward defences. We will enhance our battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance up to brigade levels. We will transform the NATO response force and increase the number of high readiness forces to well over 300,000.
Well, during a meeting with his Swedish and Finnish counterparts, Boris Johnson welcomed the two Nordic nations to the military alliance.
It's great news for NATO, and I think one thing that the clear message that it sends is that NATO is a peaceful and a defensive alliance, and that could not be clearer.
And very supportive. Thank you for that.
Yes. Thank you for all the support. It's been absolutely crucial for us.
We are absolutely thrilled.
A royal source says the Prince of Wales would never again handle large cash donations for his charities. For the first time, a senior palace source has responded to reports that emerged at the weekend that Prince Charles was handed €3 million in cash in a bag by a Qatari sheikh. Clarence House said the money was passed immediately to Prince Charles' charities and all the right processes were followed. The Court of Appeal has ruled the decision to end life support treatment for a 12-year-old boy should be reconsidered. Earlier this month, the High Court judge concluded that Archie Battersby was dead and said doctors could lawfully stop providing treatment. But his parents appealed that decision, saying his heart was still beating. 3 Court of Appeal judges have now ruled there should be another High Court hearing, but a date hasn't yet been set. The policing minister has accused the Mayor of London of being asleep at the wheel over failures by the Metropolitan Police. Kit Malthouse was speaking after the force was placed under special measures by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, following a series of scandals, including the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer. Mr Malthouse said Sajid Javid needs to stop blaming others.
The Mayor has been asleep at the wheel and is letting the city down. Teenage homicides in London were the highest they've ever been in the last year, and 23% of all knife crime takes place in London, despite it having only 15% of the UK population. The Mayor must acknowledge that he has profound questions to answer. He cannot be passive and continue as he has. He must get a grip.
The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have paid tribute to Dame Deborah James, describing her as an inspirational and unfalteringly brave woman whose legacy will live on. The podcaster, known as Bowel Babe, died yesterday at the age of 40, 5.5 years after being diagnosed with incurable bowel cancer. Donations to the fund she set up for cancer research have now hit £6.8 million. Speaking on her podcast, Dame Deborah convinced one listener, Margaret Murtagh, to check out her own symptoms. Margaret was then diagnosed, treated and survived bowel cancer.
I was messaging her, and she was messaging back. She had lots of followers, but she was just so kind and so sweet, and was giving me advice when I was in hospital, saying, what was your, what was the size of your tumour? And actually, when we met up, she was so lovely. She was like, come in the picture, let's take a selfie. And she was so sweet. We were comparing sort of tumour sizes. She was like, oh, mine was 6.5 centimetres. And I was like, oh, God, mine was 7. And the one thing she said was that I am so pleased that you are the reason why I do this work, because you are an early stage survivor.
You're up to date on GB News. More news as it happens. Now back to Brazier.
So it's over 12,000 migrants who have now crossed the English Channel this year and have made it to UK shores. It's up from a little over 5,000 this time last year, with the Rwanda plan facing strong opposition from human rights lawyers and charities and activists, even the UNHCR. Well, there may be another possible form of deterrent the government's got up its sleeve to cut the number of people crossing in small boats. Elements of the new Nationality and Borders Act came into force yesterday, actually, to little fanfare. The Act creates a new legal power. It's got the potential to send anyone caught piloting a boat carrying migrants in the Channel to jail for life. I mean, at least that's potentially what it can do. Let's turn to a former Border Force chief, Kevin Saunders, who's there, as you see, to talk about this. Kevin, welcome to you. We were talking about the story an hour ago with Stephen Wolfe, who said, interesting idea that you will actually make people on the beaches of France, as they're about to board their dinghy, maybe think twice, in the sense that, it's not the traffickers who have got their hand on the outboard motor, it's probably one of the people getting on the dinghy. And if they know that the person who is piloting, skippering effectively that craft across the Channel might go to prison for life, that would have a deterrent effect.
Yes, I think it would. I really do think it would. This is another
another arrow in the quiver of things the Home Secretary has, and I think this is a good one. What we actually need is to actually have a queue. We need to identify one of these people and have a prosecution, because that will send a message.
Kevin, we've got a lousy connection. I do apologise. We'll try and maybe get back to you and talk about it in a wee while. As we do that, Harry Mount's my presenter's guest today. Intractable problem. Rwanda offered up as a solution by the government. Legal challenges have mired that in a morass for months, we think. But this new act maybe offers some scope?
Well, as your guest was just saying, just passing the legislation won't work. There's no single trafficker who will think he'll be quaking in their boots today because of what the British government has done. But if, as your guest says, actually they see people being prosecuted and going to jail, then it might have an effect. And the tragic thing is these poor benighted souls desperate to get here, but you have to do something ruthless to stop them coming. Of all the measures, this one, if it does work, seems to be fairly targeted and not that ruthless. So here's hoping it does work.
You mentioned Australia an hour ago and that example they set of tough love. And I know it's become a bête noire for human rights campaigners what happened in Australia, but it seems to be undeniable. Undeniable that actually if you say to people, you make it pretty clear, if you arrive here under your own steam, and often, it has to be said, in some bad faith, these are people burning, throwing their identity documents overboard, etc., etc. In Australia, they said, you will be taken to an island and processed. And because you've come here in these circumstances, we're not going to smile on your application. And when that message went back to the places people were coming from, that you won't get in, actually have a pretty hard time, it ended up saving lives.
It was undeniably effective, and if you look at the figures, they completely collapsed to, I think, literally zero in terms of trafficking. I think there is something now, whether it's because of Britain and the EU, that it seems that we're not able, something in the climate, our approach to these things, as well as the legal situation, which means we won't be able to do it quite so easily. We have tried before, haven't we, tried to get the French to take them back. That seems to be impossible. So I do have sympathies with the British government. They're trying lots of different measures, and none of them are sticking.
Apologies for people listening on radio. We just saw some pictures of Border Force officials on jet skis. Do you remember the idea about pushback?
Yes, yeah.
That they'd go into the middle of the channel, and they would push back. There we go. Push back the dinghies into French territorial waters until Home Office lawyers worked it through and thought, well, hang on, all it takes is one drowning. And the whole thing falls apart. So they've explored multiple alternatives, if you can have multiple alternatives, and Rwanda seems the best thing that we've come up with.
Yes, although that seems to be mired in legal difficulties, so perhaps it'll end up being a series of legal measures like the one that's just been passed.
Harry, thanks very much indeed. Well, it's been confirmed, different story, been confirmed Finland and Sweden will receive formal invitations to join the NATO alliance. Russia's described the move, announced at the NATO summit in Madrid as destabilising. Let's turn to the former British Army Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon for his thoughts on this one. Hamish, welcome to you. Can we just talk to begin with about the Turkish objections, which eventually went away? But how do we feel about Turkey being a little bit in NATO, a little bit out of NATO, and a little bit friendly towards Russia? Would you expect your loved ones, would I expect my loved ones, to go to fight for Turkey when they can't decide whether there are friends or foes?
Well, I think it's a really difficult position, Colin. And, Turkey believes that the PKK Kurdish resistance fighters are terrorists and seems to think that, I think it's Sweden, has been helping them out. So it is a really tricky area here. But I must say, all the work that I've done in Syria on the humanitarian side, I've found the Turks the most steadfast and the most helpful. And when so many other countries really turn their back on Syria and let the humanitarian situation go to pieces in the front of Russian aggression, it was really just the Turks who helped. So it's a really tricky position. But I think today is a very important day for NATO. It is a terribly sad fact that these two countries, Finland and Sweden, who've sought fit to be neutral for so many years, now believe that that is an untenable situation with Russian aggression in Ukraine, and they're joining NATO, I think very much strengthens NATO, strengthens our resolve, and gives us much better security, particularly across Europe. But it is a sad reflection on where we are. But as we know, this illegal invasion by Russia, which the Russians thought would be well over by now, is escalating. And I think by having these two very powerful countries join us, very powerful in military terms, hopefully it'll make it less likely that Putin will escalate to other weaponry, particularly on the nuclear side, I'm thinking here, and perhaps will bring him to the negotiation table a bit earlier than would have happened hitherto.
And just in terms of troop deployment, so we're looking at a greatly increased number of British troops to a country like Estonia, do you think?
Well, I think that's certainly what Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, has been mentioning today, firming up our battle group in Estonia, perhaps talk about increasing that to brigade size, which would probably be 2 or 3 times the size. But also, very importantly, the day before yesterday, General Patrick Saunders, the new Chief of the General Staff, has said we must reconfigure our military to make sure that it can defeat Russia, because for the last 20 years or so, we've been fighting counterinsurgency, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And it's a very different battle, a very different force structure that you need to fight an army like Russia. And we need to restructure for that. And lots of talk about defence spending. We've really taken risks with our military since the end of the Cold War. And, it is the first job of the government to provide the security for this country. And that ostensibly comes from the military and security services, but ostensibly the military. And we now need to make sure that our military going forward is fit for purpose so that we can ensure that Russia goes no further than it is at the moment.
Hey, Mr. Bretton Gordon, as ever, really appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mount alongside me today, my studio guest. Harry, if you had a young man or woman, family member, maybe just leaving school, fresh out of university, and they were saying, I'm thinking of signing up. Are they more likely to see active service, you think? Is it a career that's now more meaningful than it was a year ago, 2 years ago?
I'd have thought so. And Colin, you'll know, like me, many soldiers serving and retired who it always strikes me as a coward how admirable they are that they always want to see action. I met one the other day, now retired, who was very sad that he missed out on fighting in the Falklands. So it seems strange to me, but very admirable. I think there is that much greater chance of it happening. And as Hamish was saying, it's sad of Sweden and Finland having to lose their neutrality. But at the same time, as many commentators have said, it's the last thing Putin wanted. He was terrified about NATO becoming more powerful on his western border. Well, this is exactly what's happening now. And that wonderfully simple principle of you attack one, you attack all. I don't actually think Putin is mad. He's quite logical. I thought it's highly unlikely he'll now be starting to expand into Sweden and Finland. So from that point of view, it seems to me quite a good move.
Just one very brief question. Spending choices, taxation choices, there's only so much of the cake we can slice so many ways from the tax take. We've just been talking about police numbers. Last week we were talking about rail strikes, transport, cost of living crisis. Defence of the realm, obviously, the key ambition of a government, responsibility of a government. Should we spend more on defence? Can we spend more on defence?
Well, I think we should, but I don't think we can. I mean, I think with the fortune we understandably spent on COVID and protecting the country against it, the money isn't there. 2% still seems to be actually pretty high, and I think it's the third highest in the world. And so it would be great to have the money. We don't. I mean, the effective thing is about something like Sweden and Finland joining NATO is that's essentially no cost to us at all, but it's incredibly powerful from a geopolitical point of view.
I'm always amazed how many senior military figures, people like Richard Danatz, when I've said to him, what about that £12 billion that goes on foreign aid? Oh no, it's really important, let's keep it. Just seems odd. A boom in staycations over the COVID pandemic has led to a 40% rise in the number of people buying properties to rent out to tourists in England. The seaside town of Scarborough has seen the biggest rise in holiday-let properties, with almost 1,000 more rental homes now than in 2018. Second place went to North Devon. The figure went from 1,319 to 1,758. Some campaigners there are calling for tighter regulations as they claim holiday-let properties are pushing established residents out and ruining local neighbourhoods. Let's talk to the founder of the North Devon Housing Crisis Group, Emma Hookway, who joins me now. Emma, welcome to you. An hour ago, we had a property expert who said, look, all these NIMBYs complaining about money coming into an area without which it would collapse. I think you take a different view.
Well, we do rely upon the tourist industry. I'm not, saying that we don't, but it's oversaturated at the moment, and what we need to do is get the balance back, which we had previously before COVID.
We go about doing that, Emma, and just paint a picture of how a neighbourhood can be hollowed out sometimes. Villages I can think of in the prettier parts of England where you go there in the week, there aren't many lights on until the weekend.
I mean, in all fairness, there's a village very close to me, Georgeham, and the high occupancy of second homes and tourist places means that during winter it's absolute ghost town. I think this is more prevalent at Christmas time because you'll walk down the streets and you won't see the Christmas tree lights on. It's really sad that also this primary school in that area is also having to advertise for children because they're at risk of closure because they can no longer get children into the schools.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it becomes a kind of tax on prettiness, doesn't it? If you live in a pretty community that people want to live in with a lovely view and lovely architecture, people will want to move there, and the locals who can trace their ancestry there back generations, well, if they're not earning lots of decent money, and often in rural areas that's difficult, they've got to move to the nearest town.
It's not even the nearest town anymore because the nearest town is being saturated as well. North Devon is notoriously pretty across the board. So, I live in Braunton, but if I couldn't find a property in Braunton, I wouldn't either be able to find one in Ilfracombe, I wouldn't be able to find one in Barnstaple, Westwood Hoe, Bideford. The place, literally, there is no rentals at all available, hardly at all. And if they are, they're extortionately overpriced. We've seen rental prices increase within 2 years of about £300 to £400 on a property.
And then when we talk about holiday rentals, is there a problem with the sort of longer lets or with something like Airbnb? I'm a complete hypocrite about this. I sort of hate what Airbnb can do to a neighbourhood. It can hollow it out, this endless hamster wheel of a new resident. But even as I become one of those new residents, because I quite like the idea of staying there with my kids, what is your objection more with the Airbnb model or with the second homeowner?
It's neither. I don't necessarily object to any of them because I think everyone's entitled to do what they want to do. It's the oversaturation. What we've seen due to COVID and people staycationing in is that second homes were normally more high spec houses, and so were the holiday lets. But now what we're seeing is landlords giving Section 21s to local residents in your 2-bed, your 3-bedroom home that never before would have been considered for a holiday home. Or they're selling them again because property prices have increased by about 30% this side of the water where I live. So for a lot of people, it's an opportunity to make a lot of money very quickly.
Yeah, no, that's undeniably happening, isn't it? And in a sense, when inflation's really high and stocks and shares and, your savings account isn't doing very well, people are looking for alternative ways of sweating their assets and making their money work for them. And is there a role here for local democracy? Again, our previous guest 1 hour ago was talking about the NIMBYs, for which sometimes I just look at a parish council, or a borough council that can really speak for people who are local and upset.
Well, we're pushing as a group for quite a few things. One of them is to have regulation on the amount of holiday lets that are allowed within the area. Because quite often the roads can't actually even cope for the amount of people that are coming in now. Parking doesn't allow for it, facilities don't allow for it. We're also looking that for people being put into temporary accommodation, that the rules get updated because we've got people now living in temporary accommodation, which isn't temporary anymore because there's nowhere for them to live. So they can be there 9 months, 12 months, and they're not allowed to have people to come over to stay. They're not allowed to leave the property for 24 hours, otherwise they run the risk of losing it. We're also looking at trying to get the government to acknowledge that our rental prices have increased by so much that they take this into account when they're using like the housing calculator for universal credit benefits for people.
Emma, it's a tricky problem, and you can be looked at from different directions, can't it? But you've offered us one perspective today. Emma Hookway, thanks very much for your time. Thanks a lot. Harry Mount, my studio guest today. Harry, we talked about this an hour ago, and you know, we're aware of the flip side of this, which is that sometimes in more isolated communities, incomers, grockles, whatever you want to call them, they can bring money in that's much needed, but you can understand the grievance of people who've lived there for years, whose family have lived there for years.
Of course you can. I think the answer is to let people build more. I mean, most villages, towns and cities in this country have gradually grown over the centuries. They begin with medieval heart, Georgian ring round the edge, if you like it, like a sort of archery target, Victorian buildings on the edge. And then that's come to a halt in many places because of planning legislation. And so the answer seems to me, as you say, people want to go to these beautiful places, is allow people to build beautiful new houses, perhaps keep some of them just to locals, on the edge of those pretty villages and towns.
I was just minded when we saw the, again, apologies for listeners on radio, lovely pictures, beach in Devon. I mean, we've always loved our beaches, haven't we? I'm sure, but I was on the South Coast recently and reading a magazine about coast living, and I thought, my God, the country's now obsessed with living by the sea, isn't it?
Well, it is, and that has actually boomed under COVID. As you said, the amount of people staying on a holiday in Britain has gone up by 40%. And I could see why. My family have got a second home in Pembrokeshire, and there is something magical about being near the sea, and it's a dream for all of us that's relatively easy to do, because I think it's right, I'm right in saying any house in Britain is no less than 70 miles from the sea. So it is attainable, but only if you've got the money, obviously.
Harry, thanks very much indeed. Coming up here, a woman who pretended to have cancer to raise more than £45,000 has been jailed. Charity regulators say more widely that charity scams cost the taxpayer around £1.6 million a year. The chief executive of the fundraising regulator will join me next to talk about this woman's scam. She's in prison for more than 2 years. Back in a moment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you. We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Coming up on The Mark Steyn Show, the crumbling cops. After the Met Police was put into special measures following systemic failures, former Chief Superintendent Palm Sandu will be here to shine a light on whether this is the final nail in the coffin for the struggling force. All the stories of the vaccine injured and bereaved now form part of the government inquiry into COVID. We'll be taking a closer look at the small print. Plus, the Statman is back. Jamie Jenkins will be separating the facts from the fiction and is on a mission to get all of us looking beyond the smoke and mirrors. All that and more on The Mark Steyn Show tonight from 8 o'clock.
Now, a woman who pretended to have cancer raised more than £45,000 from a GoFundMe page using a fake story to convince people to donate in good faith. Nicole El-Kabas from Kent, formerly worked at Harrods as a fashion consultant, spent over £36,000 of those donations she received on a mixture of things, including gambling and holidays. This week, she got a 2-year jail term for fraud, has been ordered to pay back £5 of the cash donated. I suspect that may be over time. Charity regulators say that £1.6 million worth of the public's donations was lost to online charity fraud over the past year. That is an annual increase of 16%, though it ought to be stressed in the context of many, many, many millions that go very much to the right places. We're joined by Gerald Oppenheim, who's the Chief Executive of the fundraising regulator. Gerald Oppenheim, thanks so much for your time. How rare a fraud is this?
Fraud, unfortunately, goes on in everyday life across everything that we do. Online fraud is a growing problem, not just for people raising money for their own causes, but also in relation to charities. The particular case that you mentioned in opening, Colin, wasn't actually a charity fraud as such. This was an individual seeking to raise money under false pretenses, and she got sentenced yesterday. But the point is, fraud is growing, and anything that you do online, you need to be really careful before pressing that button that commits some money that you might otherwise want to donate.
And in a sense, when you want to donate to a charity, that comes with certain safeguards, doesn't it? So it's a different situation, as in this particular example, where somebody's tugging at the heartstrings with a story which usually is true, sometimes isn't. Sometimes they've gilded the lily or completely made up a story in this particular instance, and they can use a fundraising website in a relationship that's the recipient and the donor, and never the regulator comes between them.
That's absolutely right. Donating to a charity is very safe because you can make certain checks. You can go onto our website to find out if they're registered with us. You can go onto the Charity Commission's website and find out an awful lot of information about the charity, and that will help you make a decision about whether to donate or not. The problem here is that it's an individual with a compelling story, which in this case turns out not to be true. People are moved by that and they donate. What we would say is be very, very careful, because what you're doing is putting your money into someone's private bank account. If you think that it's a good risk, well, then you'll go ahead. If you don't, then just don't do it. Just keep back, give the money to something that you can trust for certain.
It's such a moral quandary, isn't it? Because people will be tempted by the idea that actually a relatively modest amount of money can save somebody's life, which is what this scam was involving. So, sometimes you can make a donation to a big charity, it disappears into this huge pot of funds, necessarily so. Whereas for somebody with a story like this one, you think, well, I could actually save this person's life, maybe.
Yes, and that's what makes the story so compelling and encourages people to respond to their best instincts and give. The public, as we know in this country, is hugely generous. Over £350 million now to the Disasters Emergency Committee Ukraine appeal. People are just unbelievably generous with their time, with their money, and they want to help. The sad thing is that when that is the general case, there are people around who do take advantage of that. And those are the ones that you have to watch out for as best you can. You can take all the security precautions you like on a website to make it secure, but somebody with determination sadly will get through.
Gerald Oppenheim, appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mount alongside me in the studio. What we don't know, I don't know whether there's any data on this, it'd be very hard to get to, is whether this particular crook who's been jailed for 2.5 years this week is the tip of the iceberg or just, you know, a lone figure who stands for not very much beyond their own personal greed.
Well, as you said, Colin, in your intro, actually that figure, although on its own 1.6 million seems a lot, that's tiny compared to the huge amount, as Gerald says, that the British people are very generous. It seems to me it comes down to trust. I completely trust, for example, my godson who's going on a 13-mile charity walk this weekend, and we quite rightly trusted the late, great Dame Deborah James, impeccable. The difficult thing is when you come up with someone like this crook, that now you're going to have to tend not to trust strangers like that, and that's the sad price to pay.
Harry, for now, thanks very much indeed. Coming up, we're going to be asking, is an ageing population in and of itself a good thing? Census data suggests that there are more older people in the UK than before. That's not a headline. We sort of knew that was happening. 1 in 6 people are now over 65. There's been a large rise in the over 90s too. But is it useful to a society? What about those sort of creative, entrepreneurial animal spirits that tend to be associated with younger folk rather than older folk? How does it change a society when it gets older? We're discussing that. First, let's bring you up to date.
With the latest news headlines is what Colin was saying, and here they are. NATO leaders meeting in Madrid have decided to officially invite Finland and Sweden to become members. Earlier, the Prime Minister went with the Nordic leaders to welcome them to the alliance. NATO's Secretary-General says the decision demonstrates the alliance's door remains open. He said NATO is being transformed at a pivotal time.
Today, at the summit, NATO leaders decided a fundamental shift in our defence and deterrence to respond to a new security reality. We will strengthen our forward defences. We will enhance our battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance up to brigade levels. We will transform the NATO response force and increase the number of high readiness forces to well over 300,000.
A royal source says the Prince of Wales would never again handle large cash donations for his charities. For the first time, a senior palace source has responded to reports that emerged at the weekend that Prince Charles was handed €3 million in cash in bags by a Qatari sheikh. Speaking to the Sunday Times newspaper, Clarence House said the money was passed immediately to his charities and all the right processes were followed. The Court of Appeal has ruled the decision to end life support treatment for a 12-year-old boy should be reconsidered. The High Court had concluded Archie Battersby was likely to be dead and said doctors could lawfully stop providing treatment. His parents, though, appealed that decision, and today 3 judges said there should be another High Court hearing. A date for reviewing the case, though, hasn't yet been set. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News and Colin Brazier's back in just a second.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
A quick snapshot for you of today's markets. The pound is 1.215 to the dollar and the pound is 1.160 to the euro. And if you want to buy an ounce of gold, you'll have to fork out £1,496.94.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News, investments that matter.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you. We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Been focusing on that story about migrants today, changes in the law, what difference will it make? Emails coming in about it. David says we don't need complicated schemes or legal changes to deal with this problem. We must be ruthless and risk upsetting our French, he puts this in quotes, friends, by sending every illegal arrival immediately back to Paris on the Eurostar. Why are we so weak? Terry says, how would we know who's driving? This is the point about prosecuting the person who's in charge of the outboard motor. How will you know who's driving if they throw their identification papers overboard? I don't know, could we take a photograph, use a drone, use a plane? Sian says, the actual traffickers don't get their feet wet. Sian, you're right about that. They give the rudder to a minion or refugee in charge with a, and she puts this in quotes too, compass. The new legislation is good as a deterrent message, but it doesn't hit the criminal organisers where it hurts. Keep the thoughts coming in. Our debate this hour. The latest census data suggests there are more older people in the UK than before. 1 in 6 people now over 65. There's been a large rise in the over 90s. We'll put the question boldly, is an ageing population a good thing? The demographer and author, Dr. Paul Morland, is here, as is the editor of the Oldie Harry Mount. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Paul, we know it's a good thing. The fact we've got an older population means people are living longer. Rejoice, therefore. But there are downsides. If you've got an older population, that sort of cohort of young men and women who are energetic and ambitious and keen to leave their mark on the world, take risks in business, that sort of thing, there are fewer of them.
It's a good thing that we are living longer and nobody wants to die tomorrow, or very few of us anyway. And so it's a result of a good thing that we have more older people. But the fact that people are living longer doesn't necessitate them having fewer children. So we could have longer life expectancy and yet have more kids. And with all these wonderful older people we have around, we do need more doctors, we need more nurses, we need more people in the healthcare services. As the population grows generally, we need more workers in all fields. And a rising older population means that there are fewer workers relative to the population as a whole. And it also puts a lot of strain on the state. The state is expected to do more and more, as we know. And the state has to do that more and more, whether it's in healthcare or in pensions, from an ever-shrinking, or at least not growing, base of taxpayers.
Harry, people don't care about the pyramid of, the inverted pyramid, which is like this. There we go. Look, I'm doing my own graphics now here on GB News. There you go. The inverted pyramid with the taxpayers on the bottom and the old folk on the top, and the pyramid is going more and more like that rather than more and more like that. Does that enlighten anybody?
Yes, no, it does. It enlightens me, yes. And also, most of those old people have worked very hard throughout their life as well. And on a more general point, I would say this, because I'm editor of the oldie magazine, the average age of our readers is 68. But hopefully this information will lead to a greater respect for and interest in the old, partly because of my job. I spend a lot of time with older people, and it's a great joy. They know more stuff. One of the great joys about editing the oldie is if I'm commissioning an article on, say, Tony Hancock, you don't have to say Tony Hancock, the famous comedian who died in 1968. The readers will know that already. And another great joy about being among the old people is they're relatively unshockable. We hold these regular literary lunches, and I've never, ever, ever had a complaint in 5 years of doing this job from an old person for someone saying something that was outrageous or politically incorrect. And I think there's a thing which was first enshrined by my predecessor, Richard Ingrams, who founded the Oldie in 1992, 30 years ago, is that the old have often been ignored by advertisers and the media because they're always obsessed with the young. But actually, the old have the money and they have the time, and now there are many more of them. So I hope this news will lead to a greater interest in the old.
They've certainly got the money. I mean, Paul, we had a story last week about the triple lock on pensions. It's going to cost the Exchequer, the taxpayers, us, an extra £10 billion a year. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. There are more of them. They make more noise. They get more attention. They get more cash.
Well, it's interesting, actually, how electoral politics has become very much an issue of age. So if you go back to the 60s and the 70s, you could pretty successfully predict how someone voted based on their income or their class or their level of education. Roll the camera forward to the last election and the election before, and there was a very distinct divide between the older population voting Conservative and the younger population voting Labour. And of course, the older population are getting more numerous, and the older population much more likely to turn out. So quite apart from being the squeaky wheels, they have the tradition and the culture of going to the polling booths. It's very important that we encourage that democratic culture in the young so that we don't find fewer and fewer people vote over time. And if the Conservatives want to stay in power in the medium term, they are going to have to make sure that they spread their message to younger people and don't purely rely on the older vote. It's very easy to rely on the older vote and service that older vote.
Just talking of what we rely on, Paul, how reliable is this data? I mean, I know, it's a ludicrous question. We're talking about the national census, for heaven's sake. But I know this is only part of the release that will come. There'll be more to come later. But is it completely reliable now?
No data is completely reliable. It's complemented by other things. So there are other surveys, there's market data, there's national statistics that are drawn up. So it has to be seen in a wider context. The first census in this country was in 1801. It was pretty basic and asked pretty basic questions. The questions change over time. You have to take all data with a pinch of salt. But a census in the UK in the year 2021 is getting towards about as reliable demographic data as you're going to get.
Harry, I've moderated debates on the telly for years about intergenerational strife. It's coming, the young resent the old and all the breaks they had. They resent the fact they've got to pay for their university education, didn't get a foot on the housing ladder. If it is strife, it's of a fairly gentle kind, isn't it?
I think so. And there's a very good story told by Simon Jenkins, former editor of the Times and former chairman of the National Trust. And when he was chairman of the Trust, lots of right-on trendy figures would say, it's very, very unnerving and worrying. The vast majority of people who go to National Trust properties over 55. And he said, I hate to break it to you, ladies and gentlemen, you're all going to be over 55 one day. So it's a strange thing. It's not like two opposing, Arsenal and Spurs supporters. One group will eventually become the other group. And therefore, they'd be misguided of the young to take against the old. We'll all be old one day. Even you, Colin.
Harry, thanks very much indeed. Paul, thanks for coming and appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to reflect on John Lewis. Oh, yes, the retail chain John Lewis will soon offer Botox injections in half a dozen UK locations in London, Edinburgh, Milton Keynes, Southampton, Kingston and Cambridge. I don't know why I've listed them for you. We'll offer the injections to those aged over, there we go, age again, aged over 25. The company says it's after an increase in demand for anti-wrinkle treatment. The journalist and broadcaster Angela Epstein joins me now. Angela, welcome to you. We were attracted to this story because it feels like once John Lewis are involved in something, it's an act of normalising. It's sort of normalised Botox. Anybody, and I include myself, who had sort of misgivings about Botox, about the idea that you could want to routinely keep your appearance youthful. I mean, I know there are very many different sides to this, and it doesn't need to be judgmental. But the essential point is that by John Lewis doing this, how mainstream, totally mainstream now.
Well, I wouldn't do it, Colin. I mean, you mustn't gild the lily there. I mean, as far as you're away. But in all seriousness, I think, look, there's nothing morally wrong with this. If John Lewis choose to extend their customer base this way, that's for them, and they obviously see a marvellous market opportunity there. But I think you touch on something far more fundamental. John Lewis, you know, we associate with the cosy Christmas ads, with reliable retail outlet, with sort of, you know, nice, friendly staff who will always help us if we go in there. I mean, it's a marvellous advert for John Lewis. And what they're now doing is they're making mainstream something which some people are still sort of a little unsure of, because it taps into this whole notion that you can't age naturally without questioning whether wrinkles are a good or a bad thing. Lots of people are comfortable in their own skin. But it's this idea of John Lewis sort of embracing it makes us feel that we're teetering towards this world where everything has to be perfect. I have no sort of criticism if people want to have Botox, and plenty of clinics do provide it. But I think John Lewis just seems very uncomfortable as a place to get it from.
I just wonder, Angela, as well, I mean, just to be kind to John Lewis in this, I mean, the people who are arguing how we stop the high street collapsing, they'll say, you know, when you're up against, if you've got bricks and mortar retail space and you're up against the online retailers, you've got to offer an experience, not just flog stuff. So, and this falls into that bracket, doesn't it? You know, come into John Lewis, have a bit of Botox and buy a kettle while you're at it.
Well, yes, absolutely. Or you could have a facial with the steam from the kettle. I mean, there's all sorts of sort of interesting marketing ploys that we could sort of explore here. I think you're right. Retailers have had a very, very tough time. Lots of them, you know, rest in peace, Debenhams and various other places, and various high streets have gone very quiet now. So yes, they have to sort of keep in step with the changing demand of customers and consumers. But I think there's an issue here about what its brand says to people. Precisely because you can go elsewhere for Botox, it's not a unique service. And I think we sort of move towards John Lewis for the things that I've mentioned before. And I sort of find it a little bit, I find it a little bit cold that John Lewis are offering this now. I mean, they're entitled to, but I go to that store for particular reasons, just as the same way I go to other stores for something perhaps a bit edgier, a bit more contemporary, different things. You know, John Lewis is wonderful for so many things, not least its customer service. And I just sort of imagine a kindly person in a sort of smart black John Lewis outfit that they all wear, always looks very sympathetic, saying, "Come on, love, let's sort out your wrinkles." And it just sort of feels not right, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. I just feel there's a confusion in the branding here.
Yeah. Angela, I'll tell you what, we've got Harry Mount, editor of The Oldie, in, and I don't know what the editorial policy of The Oldie is on age-reducing Botox. Is there one, Harry?
Well, despite my terrible skin, I have no desire for Botox, but I think it's actually really good to normalise medical procedures in somewhere as wonderful and familiar as John Lewis. I go to a private GP, I won't name them, a great big company where you pay 59 quid for an appointment. And actually, they rent rooms all over the places, in shops, in offices. And that seems to be particularly a time when NHS is really strained. Really good that you can have all sorts of medical procedures in places like John Lewis, where we feel comfortable. I think, was it John Betchman who said when he felt miserable, he went to John Lewis because he always felt comfortable there? Well, I feel the same way, and that you should be able to spread medical procedures across places like that.
Is it a medical procedure? Anybody?
It's not a medical. I mean, Botox is used. There are certain medical conditions, such as spasmodic torticollis, where people have when they can't move their neck muscles. I mean, Botox has been used for certain medical conditions and used well, and that denigrate that. But I think this is very much about the cosmetics.
OK. We've got to leave it there, guys. Really thought-provoking conversation. Angela, Harry, thanks both very much indeed. Now, the boss of one of Britain's largest pub chains is calling on young people, more young and old people, young people, to embrace bar jobs as the hospitality industry struggles to fill vacancies. This is the Green King chief exec, Nick McKenzie, who says young people should view the jobs as being as important as university degrees because of the career development opportunities they provide. The CEO of UK Hospitality is Kate Nichols, who joins us now. Hi to you, Kate. It's nice to talk to you again. We talked to you a lot during lockdown, didn't we? Thank goodness we've moved on since all that malarkey. A career, I mean, we had a bricklayer on yesterday saying, consider a career in construction. I sort of get that. I've got teenage daughters who do, and early 20s, who do bar work. I wouldn't want them to do it for life, necessarily.
Well, I think that there are misperceptions about what a job in hospitality can be and what it can do and how far it can take you. So there are lots of people like your daughters who will want to do part-time work in the industry, and that will give them transferable skills, soft skills that many employers would find valuable. It will set them up for life, be able to go on and have a career in another part of the economy. But for hospitality, we offer a route through very rapidly with degree-based apprenticeships in the venue to go from entry-level jobs like your daughters are doing right the way through to management within 18 months, 2 years. And that gets people up to be managing a hospitality outlet, multi-million-pound outlets that generate a large amount of revenue, and that provides them with very good career paths and career opportunities. And let's not forget also, you can then move into marketing, law, building, planning, architecture. So the industry is vast. The opportunities are more than just those frontline vacancies and jobs that people see as a temporary measure. And that's what today's report is about, explaining to people that you can start at the entry level, rise rapidly, and in no other sector of the economy will you have authority delegated to you at such a young age and at such a young level within the sector. And it's backed by award-winning training.
And I'm absolutely with you on the soft skills. And actually, what a fantastic antidote working in a bar. And I've seen this myself in the case of one of my daughters, suffused in an environment through the Students' Union, terribly woke. Suddenly, you're in a pub, you're dealing with some lovely people, some less lovely people, range of ages, range of backgrounds. You've got to make it work.
Absolutely, and these are skills that our young people haven't really developed over the last 2 years. They've been locked down, they haven't been in schools. Their social skills are not as good as they could be. Working in a pub, bar, restaurant, coffee shop, hotel, you're working as part of a team in a very collaborative way. There's a great sense of camaraderie. You're dealing with finance, HR, conflict resolution, customer services. All of these things are valuable skills. And most importantly, you come to work and you have fun. We are a good environment that backs you and supports you.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Appreciate your time. We say thank you to Harry Mount as well, who I know enjoyed conflict resolution as a euphemism for something else in a pub. And thanks to all our contributors today and those emails too. Thanks very much indeed. Michelle Dewberry next.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. There is some brighter weather out there this afternoon, but rain or showers are affecting many places, and it is on the cool side. Temperatures a little below average for the time of year. Low pressure towards the northwest at the moment, and really that's how things are shaping up through the next few days into the weekend, before it looks like improvements are on the way for next week. But for the time being, that low is driving a lot of clouds, some showers, and even some longer spells of rain in. So during the evening, we're expecting some wetter weather for a time in the far south and southeast of England. That moving up